how often do AI projects fail because of bad models as opposed to because no one truly owns the outcome once the system goes live? So is it the ownership or the design?
I think it can be both.
When AI starts changing how work gets done, what resistance patterns show up first?
I think the primary resistance happens at the front line.
What's the biggest red flag or signal that indicates that it's heading towards failure? Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of PureLogics Pulse, a podcast powered by PureLogics, where we explore technology trends, product innovation, and digital transformation. PureLogics is a full-service technology partner helping enterprises and startups drive digital transformation, build next-generation software products, and scale AI-powered solutions that create real business impact. I'm Mohsin Ali, and I spearhead the AI initiatives here at PureLogics, where I work across product, engineering, and enterprise clients to turn AI from experimentation to production-scale impact. 2025 was packed with studies on AI project failure, including the MIT study that suggests that 95% of AI products don't deliver expected value. But here's the thing, it's not the technology that's failing, it's the planning and the implementation gap. As we move into 2026, we'll discuss how business owners can plan effectively, identify red flags, and that prompt them to pause and reassess their AI initiatives and the workflows they need to adapt to stay ahead in this space. For this, I have Josh Shaner. He has been in the industry for nearly 2 decades. Right now, he is the founder and CEO of Braive, an organization that builds AI employees to take ownership of these failure points, delivered as a software with a service. Before we jump in, tell me what you mean by the AI employees here.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Mohsin. I appreciate it. Yeah, for me, AI employees, I think there's a lot of conversation around, agent, AI assistant, right? But really what we are trying to communicate to our ideal prospects, right, and our clients is that these are, in fact, employees, right? They are trained and designed to do a specific function within an organization. Within an organization, you've got employees that wear many hats, right? You can think of an AI employee as a simple employee that does one thing, and it does one thing really well, right? And it can do that one thing very well 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for a significantly lower cost, for example, than what you would get if you had to hire a human.
Makes sense. That gives rise to the argument that AI is going to replace us all, but we'll
Yeah,
get to
no. Right. And I don't think okay, I mean, if you want to just stay on that topic for a minute, right? I think one of the other things that we try to explain to our prospects and our clients is that these AI employees are not designed to replace humans within the organization, right? You still need a human in the loop for a lot of these employees that are developed and deployed within an organization. Okay. So I think that the idea that AI is going to replace humans like immediately, right, or even in the next decade is false. I think it's a false narrative that kind of gets spread around because people don't understand the technology. But you can't let AI kind of run loose and expect it to do the job. It can't be creative. It doesn't understand how to generate insights, right? And it's going to need people to not only train it to do what it's supposed to do, but ensure that the outcomes match what the organization actually needs. And that's where the human is, right?
Absolutely. And the oversight and determinism in the AI output is so important. That's a perfect segue into our first question of the day, the ownership gap. 2026 has just started. In 2025, we saw enterprises rush into AI initiatives without real planning. From what you're seeing, is this behavior slowing down? Or are organizations still launching first and figuring it out later?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think the disconnect really is, first of all, to answer your question, I think it's actually only ramping up because I think leadership has this pressure, right, where they're being expected to implement AI into their organizations. So they kind of jump into bed with an automation agency, or something like that to build some sort of employee or even end-to-end AI, automation solution that's supposed to replace a sales team, for example, right? And where the disconnect is that the the leadership is so gung-ho about getting this implemented, right? You haven't really got a lot of the organization on board with exactly what's happening. So failure points happen, in my opinion, when this occurs is because there's a disconnect between the frontline employees, right, and leadership. I can dig into that a little bit more if you want, or how do you want me to
Let's dig
take
into
this?
it. So,
Okay.
in your opinion, where does the failure point usually originate?
I think the failure point originates with the lack of defined processes, right, within the organization itself, and then also the lack of accountability, right? When we create an AI employee, right, designed to do one thing or a few things, right, there needs to be someone that is responsible within the organization itself to make sure that the automation is in fact doing its job. And when it hasn't done its job, or when it needs to hand off its task to a human, right? Someone needs to be accountable to make sure that that happens within the organization itself. And so I could love to start this podcast with, I guess, a failure in my agency, right? Where we were actually designing an AI employee to do outreach on behalf of a sizable behavioral health organization, right? So we built this smart AI employee to essentially do what we had designed it to do: reach out, engage the prospect, and then bring them back to this union liaison, the liaison within the organization, to have that conversation one-to-one with this C-suite individual, right, that we're trying to connect with. But the problem is that the person, the liaison, right, wasn't fully bought in. They weren't brought in early on in the conversation, so they weren't exactly sure what their job was supposed to be, and then they didn't really have any buy-in to or belief that that was actually going to work. So what had happened is that the AI was doing its job. It was engaging. It was gaining interest, and it was actually booking on prospects to our liaison's calendar. But he was completely in the dark. He didn't really focus on what the AI was doing, and instead just focused on what he had originally been brought in to do, and the old way of doing things, in other words. And so the fact that the human in the loop was something that we had designed around the AI employee, we didn't bake in an SOP for this person, right, to actually do what they were supposed to do when the AI was bringing them a prospect. In other words, and that's kind of a failure on our end, right? Because we needed to design the SOP alongside our partner that we were building with this. And as a result, it didn't really work because we had a lot of missed opportunities. And then the value obviously wasn't seen because there wasn't the expected ROI.
Absolutely. And as someone who develops these sort of tools for organizations here at PureLogics, I've encountered the same problem. In your opinion, how often do AI projects fail because of bad models, as opposed to because no one truly owns the outcome once the system goes live? So is it the ownership or the design?
I think it can be both. And this is where I think the ownership of that failure lands on both the agency and the client, right? So on one hand, you've got, so I would say 50-50, but I'm not 100% sure. I can't put a defined number on it, but I would say 50-50. Ownership on the client's end typically happens when, again, leadership is involved and wants to launch something, but frontline doesn't really have a say or hasn't bought in fully, right? And usually when that happens, it's because your AI agencies are trying to do too much too quickly, right? Instead of focusing on one defined specific employee to do one specific job, prove that it works, right? And then all of a sudden the organization now sees, wow, this thing actually does work. What else can we do, right? What else can we automate? Where else can we plug AI into our processes and our business, right? And then everybody's on board. That's typically what we do on our side, right? So that to me is where the failure happens within the organizations. And then on the agency side, it's usually because the agency is saying yes to pretty much everything, right? Even though, and I think that's just, I wouldn't say hubris, but it is an agency kind of model to say yes, because we're afraid that if we say no, that the client is going to walk and go to somebody else who says yes, right? So promising more than what you can actually deliver is the reason why agencies fail. And I think, at the client side or in the organization, again, promising internally that something's going to work without actually bringing in the employees or getting the buy-in within the organization itself is the reason why it fails there. Those are 2 points. And then the third one, obviously the bigger one for the organizations, is that they don't give the automations, the AI employees, enough time, right? And that, I think, is one of the bigger points of the MIT study, is that these enterprise level clients, right, they've got a lot of money on the line. They have shareholders that they have to answer to. And so they spend all this time and effort and money building a pilot program. But what happens is that once it's launched, they don't give it enough time to be optimized, right, to actually deliver the ROI. They expect something perfect right out the box. And obviously that's not the case when it comes to automation, right? You can spend a month or two in development, another month in testing and optimizations. And then when you actually go to launch, they expect it to be perfect.
Absolutely. And the difference between an MVP based, an AI based MVP and a production grade AI system is huge. A former guest on the podcast described it in this way, that it's like expanding the image. It becomes more and more pixelated, and the gaps appear larger and larger. The more you blow it up, the more evident the gaps are going to be.
Yep.
Uh,
It's a great
you've
analogy.
articulated it beautifully. That quick AI wins lead to shortcuts that create long-term technical debt and fragile solutions. What would be your recommendation in order to arrest this technical debt?
I mean, in my opinion, it's looking at, as an AI agency, our job should be to come in and look at the work with our clients to identify what is the biggest leaky hole within the organization that we can fix using AI automation, right? And then focus on that specific task and then solve that task through an iterative process from development to design to MVP to, full launch, and then 3 or 4 months of optimizations that it really does take to get the AI to work. So in my opinion, it's really focusing on what is going to be the highest ROI generating task that we can automate, and then focusing on building that specific employee to do that specific job. And in my opinion, what that also does is that it allows us to, develop the AI framework or foundation for the organization itself, right? When you build a home, you don't start with the roof, you start with the foundation. So you build this foundation, and then from that foundation, you've got everybody bought in to building this beautiful home, right? And now you start building the frame, and then you start putting in the windows and the doors and the roof, right? And then that's where you've got now your organization running on AI infrastructure and not just a project.
Absolutely. And I loved how you proposed that there should be a bedding in period, a period after which we have to optimize the system that's working within your boundaries. I think that's very important and often looked over when we're delivering AI-based projects. Let's talk about incentive misalignment over here. Since we were talking about behaviors, you've worked with large global organizations, you've developed solutions for them. When AI starts changing how work gets done, what resistance patterns show up first?
That's a good question. I think the primary resistance happens at the front line, right? And this is part of the reason why rushing in and building something end to end, right, that's going to do more than one specific task has a tendency to fail more often than just simply focusing on, a smaller task and automating that. Employees have to effectively learn another operating procedure within the organization itself, right? And when that happens, and I've been in business, for a long time, I've been working with, agencies. I've been working in the agency space for a really long time. And when that happens, when we are kind of required to adopt something new, right, there's going to be resistance from the get-go. And I think there's going to be added resistance when you don't have some sort of proof that it actually works, right? So throwing an SOP on top of an organization and expecting them to, hey, this is how this is going to work from now on. This is your responsibility. You need to use this new tool, this new dashboard, this new platform, right, in order to do X, Y, and Z. That's where I think a lot of pushback happens, where people don't use the technology, right, where when it's supposed to, and then you've got failure because leadership then sees nobody's adopting this, it's failed.
Absolutely. Something that I've encountered in my day-to-day work is when you build a solution that threatens to change someone's role or threatens to replace a part of what they do, they're usually reluctant in adoption as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
how their performance is measured changes, how they communicate these processes changes. How do leaders actually align incentives instead of assuming people will just adapt?
Yeah. I mean, you speak, that's a very good point, right? Where when we talk about when a AI agent or AI employee is going to replace a part of a person's job, right? It really depends, in my opinion, on what part of that job is being replaced, right? If people see it as, okay, we're bringing in an AI automation to essentially replace, our SDRs on our sales team, right? That's a threat. That's a threat not only to the SDRs who currently work at the organization, but the VP of sales, right? Or the sales director himself, because, hey, I have relationships with these people. Yes, I know I have, quarterly goals that I need to hit from a revenue standpoint, but at the same time, like this is my team, right? So there's going to be that negative pushback. But if you think about it from approaching it from another standpoint, and I have like an example of an AI employee that does really well for organizations is, just something that answers emails and forms that come in directly, right? Rather than this was an example that I'm using from one of our clients who's in the home lending space, where our VP of lending was responsible for actually checking the forms inbox, right? All of these different messages that were coming in from the website, from paid ads, from whatever, right? She was responsible for looking at them, routing them, determining whether something was of value or if something was spam or otherwise, right? And then would have to make that decision. So we simply created an AI employee to look at the inbox, right? Determine what to do with the mail, whether it was to mark it as spam, mark it as important, reply to it if it's an FAQ, and then route it to the right department, right? So that she didn't have to. So this is where, in my opinion, the difference comes in, right? Like if you could build an AI employee to do someone's timesheets, I'm pretty sure nobody would say, no, hell no, we don't want this, this thing in our organization. Everybody would be like, yes, I don't want to do timesheets. Timesheets suck, right? So same concept. Like if I don't have to do something mundane, right, that my day-to-day task requires of me, I will happily let that go and let an AI do it, right? As long as I can trust that it's actually doing its job.
Absolutely. A former guest of the podcast, Herb Hogue, said this, that AI should all be about replacing the mundane instead of replacing human capital.
Yes.
That resonates with you as well, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talking about AI adoption over here, what's the difference between teams that embrace AI employees and teams that quietly sabotage them while publicly supporting the initiative? Because you must have
Yeah.
encountered that a lot.
I mean, this is where I think a lot of agencies and organizations fails because they look to AI to replace these very fundamental components of a business, right? And to me, that's the mistake. If you are just starting to adopt AI, again, you should probably be looking at where in the organization we can make the biggest impact without ruffling, the most feathers, in other words, right? So I'll give you an example. I don't necessarily think this is sabotage. I think sabotage is kind of a heavy word that probably isn't indicative of what actually happens. I think it's just rejection of the AI simply because it's adding more work to a team's already, heavy burden, right? So the quick example is an insurance agency that I know, right, is working with an AI company to essentially help their brokers work with the insurance companies by plugging in their PDFs into the AI, and then the AI is kind of automatically looking at these PDFs and then auto-populating the information into these insurance companies' websites, and then pulling back a automated or automatically generated quote for their clients. Okay. There were so many errors, right, in the get-go from launch that the teams quickly rejected the technology simply because it was adding more work to their workload, right? So I think that's where one of these bigger failure points were. You could say that sabotage would occur in that regard because once they see that it doesn't work, right, everybody immediately says, hey, this is not working. We're just not going to use it. We're going to go back to what we were doing simply because, our butts are on the line if we don't actually get these quotes to our clients and the AI is not helping here, right? So that to me is kind of an example of, sabotage, so to speak. And that happens again, when the AI isn't necessarily given enough time to do its job. So I think the agency who was deploying this on behalf of the insurance company that they were hired to do this with failed because they didn't start in a smaller capacity, right? They could have done this by launching it with one specific individual within the organization and said, "Hey, can you work with us to see how this happens, right? How does it interact with the current insurance companies that you're working with, and what does the report look like when it gets back? What can we do to do better, right?" And then once that's kind of in a nice place, then it's like, okay, let's roll this out, right? And I think that's where the bigger problem happens is when you launch this thing, right, and the entire organization is expected to adopt it, and then it doesn't work perfectly out of the gate, you're going to get rejection and sabotage, not maybe necessarily from, the concept of the movies where they're sabotaging something, right? But more like, hey, this doesn't work. I'm not going to use it, right? And I'm going to tell all of my employees, or I'm going to complain, silently to my friends who are my teammates and say, this thing doesn't work. It sucks. Let's just reject it, right? Yeah. So lack of internal buy-in.
Absolutely. And this brings us on to it emphasizes the importance of planning before you start building. Most organizations believe that they understand their workflows, and yet usually they're wrong. Before you start building AI solutions, how do you uncover real workflow versus the ones people describe in their presentations?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, a lot of we never start an AI automation project until we've done our due diligence when it comes to speaking with stakeholders within the organization, right? So if our automation is going to touch, let's use home lending for example, right? Because if it's going to touch the loan officer team, right, as well as the servicing team, then we need to make sure we have a stakeholder from each of those teams to better understand what is their current processes, right? And how is the AI going to affect these processes, and where in their existing infrastructure can AI then be implemented, right? So that we're not necessarily changing everything out of the gate. And then the other thing that I obviously want to make sure I think is important to notice is that, like, for Braive, for us, we only focus on developing AI employees where you have the ability to measure ROI, right? If it's something internal that isn't necessarily going to necessarily correlate to revenue, right? We're not necessarily inclined to develop it, simply because we know that if we can, design an AI employee that actually increases revenue, right, then the ROI is going to be there. And then not only that, but then you've got not only stakeholders who are very inclined to see it work well, but you've got, the employees internally making sure that it's going to work well, because when the AI does its job and it brings in revenue, right, then everybody's happy.
You've nailed the issue right on the head. I think it's all related to the benefits of the solution that you're proposing, as opposed to the cost optimization that it's giving you from a human capital perspective. That's very well put.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the failure situations. In the first 30 days of an AI project, what's the biggest red flag or signal that indicates that it's heading towards failure?
That's a great question. And like, there are so many examples, I think, where you are, the hairs on the back of your head kind of stand up when you're having these conversations, is that the clients want to move too quickly, right? They expect everything in the next month. And if they're saying, hey, I want this end-to-end solution developed, right, and working perfectly within the next, that's a huge red flag in my opinion, right? So it's the agency's job to set expectations early on. And if it doesn't necessarily work, with the timelines that we set, you should be comfortable with walking away, because that to me is going to be where, if you're just doing it for the sake of bringing in the project, you're going to ignore scope creep, right? And you're going to allow this thing to kind of get bigger and bigger, and the expectations grow, and then eventually it will implode. And so, this goes kind of back to the idea of like saying yes to everything, right? We should be comfortable as AI agencies to say no, right? If we know that the technology is not there yet, or if the expectations are too high on the client side, then we need to be able to say no, or reset expectations, so that, we're all walking into this project with the expectation that it's going to succeed. Because that's one example, I would say. And the other example is just, if again, if you're on a call doing discovery with stakeholders and they are kind of playing on their phones or not necessarily paying attention, right? If they're not fully engaged in what we're developing and the questions that we're being asked, that's another red flag to me, because that just signals that the organization isn't ready or willing to kind of take this project on.
Absolutely. And you've touched on the point that you need to hold your boundaries, you need to hold on to your principles while you're competing in this space where everyone's offering you an AI product, and everyone's competing on price points, and everyone's competing on accuracy figures and on time to market. In this market, the time to market or the value proposition of a company is solely AI focused. Every company that's adopting AI is advertising the adoption of that AI. Let's talk about leaders from that perspective. At what point should leaders pause, reassess, or even kill an AI initiative instead of pushing forward due to sunk cost fallacy?
I mean, to me, it's if you're working with an AI someone who's developing AI for you is if they don't say no, right? That's a big red flag. That should be a big red flag for the organization where it's like, yeah, that's really cool. I love that idea, client, but at the end of the day, we're not ready for that, right? We don't think or this is an edge case, right? You want this optimized within your workflow or within the AI employee. To me, it's an edge case. We shouldn't spend time or effort focusing on that specific thing. We should be focusing on the big elephants in the room and make sure that, we're taking care of those before we take care of these edge cases. So does that answer the question? I have no idea.
I think it does. It communicates this in a very eloquent way that you need to hold on to your principles. You don't have to say yes to everything from an agency
Yes.
perspective.
I will say there is one scenario in which case I would like to say yes to everything. And that is when I have, a client. You can think about it as a pro bono client, right? Like a lot of agencies, my background is in marketing and sales at agencies, right? And we typically take on pro bono clients when we wanted to do some really creative work that we probably wouldn't otherwise get from a client who's, paying us a significant amount of money, right? So taking on a pro bono client has its advantages where you can kind of say yes to everything, right? Because they're in it, they know they're not necessarily paying what they would normally pay, right, to have these AI employees designed and developed. So for us, it's a beta, right? It's a testing ground where we can actually build something that fails and be okay with it. Client's okay with it because they're not really paying for it. So saying yes to everything there and seeing what potentially works and what doesn't, right, allows you to kind of have that playground to build something eventually that's going to work for maybe even a larger group where it allows you now to work within a separate vertical, right, that you probably wouldn't have gotten into, right? But now you've developed an employee that works for this industry or this vertical because you brought on this client who you were okay with saying yes to everything, and they were okay with you developing something that wasn't, that launching a V1 and being okay with the failure of a V1.
You could see the gears going around in my head when you mentioned this. That's a concept I haven't been familiar with at all. That a
Oh,
pro bono client could serve as a creative playground for you. That's an amazing way to put it. I
yep,
think
we have a couple of those, and we love them because that it's just, hey man, hey, I have this problem. Can we solve it? And I'm always going to say yes, like, yeah, hell yeah, we'll try it. Let's just see what happens, right? And no, let's just iterate and experiment. And eventually you've got something that's really cool that you're like, this has more applications. Obviously, I wouldn't say yes if it didn't have more applications beyond this one client, but in my opinion, like that is a great place to start, to your point, like have this little testing ground, this battleground where you can battle test your AIs, right? And then launch it into the wild with the larger market in mind.
that's a fantastic insight for me personally, and I'm sure for a lot of our listeners listening to this and
Yeah.
looking for rooms to experiment with, right?
Yep.
Um, let's talk about scaling and complexity now, moving away from the leadership conversations a little. When you've executed complex initiatives across multiple regions and offices, how is AI deployment fundamentally different at a larger scale?
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yes. So I can use an example of like, again, a behavioral health company we worked with or are working with that has, multiple brands across multiple states in the United States itself. And it is a bit more challenging, right? So the way we are working with them to scale is that we are choosing a specific office, right? A specific location to do all of our testing and learning, right? And then once we are all satisfied, both the agency and the client, with the specific output that is happening at that particular location, then we try to roll it out and we create a separate rollout plan. And that's not just the agency dictating how this works, right? We kind of come to our clients with an idea, like say, we're not going to launch this AI employee, nationally yet. We want to work a test market. You guys choose a test market that makes the most sense. Maybe it's the one that has the biggest leaky hole, right? That needs this AI employee the most. Or maybe it's the one that just is completely ignored, and it can be the battleground where nobody's upset if something goes wrong, right? But then from there, right, once we've battle tested and we have the AI employee working in a way that everybody is happy with, whether it's voice AI or if it's just a text-based AI, it doesn't matter. But once it's working the way our clients work, then we work with them to develop a rollout plan, right? Because again, we're not just starting with that one office, right, and then rolling it out to the rest of the offices once everybody's happy. We need to have a formal rollout plan where it's not just blow it out, to the entire organization and watch it potentially fail. Let's roll it out in a very systematic manner, right, and then work on the nuances within each of these different offices, right, because each office has different employees. They have different SOPs that vary slightly, right, and so we need to be able to account for that So I think a lot of times, bigger organizations think of AI as a magic wand. Like, hey, this thing works, let's go. Let's move it across everywhere, right? But that's where failures happen because they're not necessarily looking at it in an optimization kind of way. They're not looking at it as an iterative process. They're looking at it as a magic bullet that's going to solve this problem. And the expectation is that that problem is solved, right, in the shortest amount of time possible. Where in reality, this organization we're working with has, I think, 10 or 12 different locations, right? And that in and of itself may take a year, if not 2 years, right, to fully develop an AI employee that works within every single office, because every single office is a little bit different. And the AI employee not only needs to know the name of this different office and the people who work there, but it needs to understand the nuances that are specific to that region, right, or that particular state.
Absolutely. And
especially in a highly regulated market.
Absolutely. We could describe this as how developers break the task down as per the complexity of the task itself and do a phased roadmap of the development cycle. You need to do, or you need to plan a phased rollout of the developed application itself to suit the micro ecosystems of each subdivision of the scale that you're dividing it into. So that's very well put.
That was much more succinct the way you said it. So I like your example better.
We're collaborating here.
Yeah.
So just the closing question from my end, some advice for leaders in the industry. So if a business leader is about to greenlight an AI initiative in 2026 for their company, what is the one mindset shift they must make to avoid becoming another AI failure statistic?
Are you talking about for the agency side or the client side?
I would love for you to answer
Both?
the agency side of things. I think
Okay.
your expertise is you're uniquely positioned to answer that.
Yeah. So for an agency heading into 2026, where you've got, the green light from your client to start developing AI, I would make sure that before you launch this project and before you get into discovery, that you have a hard conversation with your client about expectations up front, right? Development can take an X amount of time, right? So will testing and learning, right? But when we go into launch, right, the expectation is that this thing can't be perfect right out of the gate. It's going to have failures and problems, right? And the focus shouldn't necessarily be on fixing errors or fixing problems. It should be focused on making sure that this AI employee does exactly what it's designed to do, right? And then you can go back and fix some of the smaller failure points. So in my opinion, the biggest, where I see a lot of AI agencies on the smaller side fail, agencies like myself, right, is just jumping into bed, saying yes to everything, and then not being clear on the expectations up front. Because the worst thing that can happen is that you say yes to everything, that the expectations, aren't necessarily set up front, and then you've got your client thinking one thing when this thing actually goes live into the wild, right, versus what you were thinking about making sure, that this thing not only goes live on time, but that we have the time to optimize and make sure that this AI employee is doing what it's supposed to do over time. So that would be my piece of advice, is have that conversation early and often.
I think that it's so important to emphasize the need or the importance of being able to be honest or transparent with your clients about the expectations. And that's probably the most difficult side of the sales life cycle. Thank you so much for your time, Josh. It's been a very insightful conversation about the failure points in AI development in 2026 from an agency perspective or from a business owner's perspective. It's been a goldmine of insight for me. Thank you so much, Josh, for your time.
Well, thank you, Mohsin. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on your show.
Thank you.